The Inca by Nigel Davies. Chapter 5. The Inca State. The heart in the middle of the body. The later Inca rulers exercised control over a vast empire centered upon the city and valley of Cusco. But Cusco was no mere administrative capital. So profound was its religious and spiritual authority that it was revered as a holy city, the very fountain of the cult of the Inca ruler as the cherished descendant of the sun, and the model for other Inca centers erected in its image throughout Tawantinsuyu. To cite Cobo, in the middle of them, the four quarters of the empire, was the royal city of Cusco, like the heart in the middle of the body. Spanish descriptions of the general aspect of Cusco are limited in scope. Pedro Pizarro, among others, concentrates on the treasures amassed in its stores. He is amazed by the variety of gold objects, including gold shoes, shellfish, birds, snakes, and even spiders. In an attempt to conceal this treasure from the conquerors, the Incas buried much of it in remote hillsides. As a further precaution, the Indians who bore it thither were killed. Coricancha, as reconstructed by Pachacutec, was an enclosure that, according to Ciesa, was surrounded by a wall of finely cut stone measuring over 400 paces in circumference. The Temple of the Sun, plated with gold, took up part of this enclosure and was flanked by other buildings that housed many priests and hundreds of mamaconas, the select females described as virgins of the sun by Francisco de Xeres, who attended the principal temples and whose duties included the weaving of the ceremonial textiles. Certain of the many ceremonies that took place in Coricancha involved the sacrifice not only of llamas but also of human victims, including children. Cobo describes Coricancha as one of the richest shrines that had ever existed in the world. Part of its treasure had been provided by curacas and governors, who brought lavish presents of gold, silver, and precious stones when they visited Cusco. Much remained in storage, as few people, only the great nobles, were allowed to use gold and silver adornments. Large amounts of gold and silver also belonged to the panacas, the guardians of the riches that former rulers had vied to amass. Miguel de Estete gives a good overall description of Cusco in its pre-conquest state. The main plaza was almost square, neither large nor small. The palace on the square, described as belonging to Atahualpa, had 2 towers and a portal with silver incrustations. Nearby was a monastery with 100 dwellings, within whose walls lived innumerable mamaconas. Not far distant from this lay the great temple of Coricancha. 4 great roads leading to the 4 quarters of the empire converge on this plaza, within which stood the Ushnu. Zuidema, in a detailed study of the Ushnu based on an ancient Andean concept, points out that many chroniclers, such as Garcilasco, Betanzos, and Sarmiento, do not mention the Ushnu at all. He cites Molina and Albornoz as the first to describe the Ushnu of Cusco. Others had existed in Huánuco and Tiwanaco. Principally dedicated to the observation and worship of the sun, it was, according to Albornoz, a pillar surmounted by a seat used only by the reigning Inca. Like Pedro Pizarro, Estete dwells upon the massive hoard of gold, in particular the gold statues in the temples. He also describes the city's spacious residential quarters, lying beyond the more compact center. Another eyewitness, Sancho de la Hoz, writes of the impressive stone houses and the narrow streets, on which 2 horsemen could barely pass each other. He relates that no poor people lived in central Cusco. Like many earlier Spanish visitors, he is impressed above all by the towering fortress of Sacsayhuaman. De la Hoz relates that Spaniards who had come from Lombardy and other great kingdoms stated that they had seen no citadel of comparable strength. Sacsayhuaman commanded a view of the whole valley, filled with houses for a distance of up to 1 league. He estimated the total number of dwellings at 100,000. In the valley of Cusco, certain vestiges of pre-Inca times still survive. Archaeological remains in the vicinity of the city, described by Rome, have already been mentioned. The valley also contains the Huari period site of Picalacta, southeast of Cusco. Its planned structures somewhat recall those of Huari itself in their homogeneity. Gordon McEwen writes of the overwhelming size and startling layout of Picalacta, whose remains cover 2 square kilometers of ground. He describes this complex as the product of a massive investment of labor, resources, and personnel. The site is among the more striking examples of pure Huari architecture in highland Peru. Imperial Cusco was essentially created by Pachacutec, though its splendors were enhanced by later rulers. Before Pachacutec, it was little more than a village. This ruler, as we have seen, built Coricancha, himself tracing with a cord the outlines of the new temple and measuring the stone blocks brought from Salu, 5 leagues distant. Another basic task was the canalization of the 2 rivers, performed by labor provided by local Caracas and involving the transportation of rough stone of a kind that would resist the ravages of the water. Betanzos, in accordance with other chroniclers, affirms that central Cusco, situated in the triangle between the 2 rivers, was the exclusive preserve of the Inca elite. Pachacutec had carved the city into 4 suyus, divided by the roads that led to the 4 corners of his nascent empire, also called suyus. Because of its triangular form, Cusco was often conceived by its inhabitants, perhaps in a somewhat metaphorical sense, as being in the guise of a mountain lion lying on its right side, with Sacsayhuaman as its head, its back formed by the Tulumayo River, its belly marked by the Huatanay River, and its tail ending where the 2 streams join. The southwestern extremity of Cusco was named Pumacchupan, meaning lion's tail. Zuidama cites an early Spanish visitor to Cusco, Juan Ruiz de Arce, as mentioning that the Inca ruler had the decoration of a lion on his golden beakers. As we shall later see in more detail, Cusco for the Incas seems to have represented not only a city but a concept. Certain provincial centers appear to have reproduced a design based on that of the capital, incorporating the division into 4 suyus and the apparent integration of symbolic sightlines into their plan of construction. The city, as seen by the Spaniards, was somewhat strange, refined, even awesome, yet it retained a primitive touch. Its temples glittered with gold but was covered by roofs of straw. Cobo asserts that Pachacutec had been influenced by the stone constructions he had seen in Tiwanaku. The grandest buildings after the temples and shrines were the palaces. When the Hanan dynasty was established, the rulers no longer lived in Coricancha. Instead, each built his own palace. Many stood on the great square of Aucahipata, which lay in the main body of the Puma and was where the most imposing ceremonies were performed. The sources differ as to which palace corresponded to each monarch. At the time Francisco Pizarro lodged in the great palace of Casana, it had only 1 entrance, on each side of which rose 2 towers built of finely cut stone but surmounted with roofs of straw. When Cusco was besieged by the rebel Inca Manco II, these roofs caught fire and the towers collapsed. In the absence of surviving pictures or plans of Cusco at the time of the conquest, a mental image of how it really looked is hard to conceive. Even the central part, though now without a somber splendor, probably lacked true monumentalism in the form of great vistas such as might enhance the grandeur of an imperial city. Notable also for their absence were the teeming markets to be found in most great capitals. The Incas relied on other forms of redistribution. Anne Kendall stresses that only the nobility, including important officials, enjoyed the right to live in central Cusco. Chroniclers concur that the Incas by privilege, as opposed to the Orejones, or original Incas, lived beyond the central triangle between the 2 rivers. Their dwellings, perhaps modest in comparison with those of the center, were set apart by a belt of open land. According to Santiago Calvo, the barrio that housed these local Caracas measured 283 hectares and was divided into 12 ayllus. Ciesa reports that most of the city was inhabited by Mirimes. Presumably, he had in mind a more extended Cusco, stretching beyond the dwellings of the Inca by privilege and possibly even embracing nearby villages. Ciesa, in the same context, mentions houses made entirely of wood and straw, of a kind he implies did not exist in the center. This greater Cusco housed not only nobles in and near its center, but also countless artisans and technicians in its outer reaches. Estimates vary widely as to the number of inhabitants. Calvo, cited above, suggests a total population of 76,000. Rowe quotes Juan Ruiz de Arce as reporting that before the fire of 1535, Cusco proper, the central part between the 2 rivers contained 10,000 houses. He further cites the estimate of De La Hoz to the effect that there were 100,000 buildings in the whole valley. Such a figure might include a fair proportion of dwellings lying even beyond the confines of the extended city and inhabited by the Mirimes settlers, among others. Although the center was allegedly the exclusive home of the Incas of royal ayllus, it also housed the llanas that served them, as well as many priests. In addition, provincial rulers were obliged to spend part of the year in Cusco, but it is not very clear where they resided. The Son of the Sun. The ruler supremacy was both temporal and spiritual. The solar aspects of the Andean high god, the ancestor of the Inca, were increasingly stressed as the empire expanded. This exaltation of Inti, the sun, was basic to the creation of the Imperial Cult. Inti became the deified royal progenitor, and his role as dynastic ancestor is described by the chroniclers. Royal ancestry is often traced to Punchao, the young sun. The Incas' solarization of the more generalized sky god may also arise partly from a massive increase in the demand for maize, a relatively low-altitude crop, sensitive to frost and more dependent upon the heat of the sun. Surpluses of maize, easily stored and moved, were needed to feed the imperial armies. The Incas thus proceeded to add to the traditional religion a new element, the belief that they were the children of the sun. According to Cobo, this fiction became a basic pretext for making war. In each imperial center, a temple to Inti was erected, served by special priests. The sources offer ample evidence as to how the role of Inti as dynastic ancestor inspired the ruler's urge to impose his authority on other peoples. Hence, this imperial cult reinforced the will to conquer. Veneration of the Inca did not end with his death. His mummy was served by a panaca endowed with great wealth, and his legend was thus retained as a living presence. Once chosen, the reigning Inca, in effect, was the state, though, as we shall see, even the power of such an exalted being faced certain limitations. Notwithstanding the unique status of the supreme Inca once chosen, the procedure by which he achieved power is less well defined. The chroniclers, with few exceptions, simply base their ideas on the Spanish monarchy and assert that the choice depended upon primogeniture, the ruler's eldest legitimate son thus becoming the rightful heir. Among those who question this accepted notion are Cristobal de Castro and Diego Ortega Morejon, who report that Huayna Capac had older legitimate brothers. The Viceroy Toledo came to perceive that the notion of primogeniture did not apply, and in a letter to the King of Spain in 1572, he wrote that the son chosen as imperial successor was not the firstborn son, but rather the son who showed the most capacity to govern. Santillan, in effect, says the same thing, but also stresses the significance of the practice of adoption of a successor by a reigning Inca. As the empire expanded, the intrigues and struggles for power marking each succession became a threat to the state. This led to a growing tendency for the number of possible mothers of a legitimate heir to be reduced to one, known as the Koya, or queen. She was the woman the Inca married on the day he received the royal tassel, either as sole king or as an associate monarch. However, some Koyas produced no heirs, whereas others had several sons, none of whom possessed a clear right to succeed. In practice, therefore, in the absence of more precise rules, a struggle for power continued to ensue on the death of each king. Even formally adopted heirs were far from immune from the challenge of rival claimants. Some chroniclers state that the ablest of the sovereign sons was elected, but ablest in this context patently implied not only political and military talent, but also a certain capacity for intrigue in order to win the greatest support among the royal Aylus making the decision. This tradition of leaving the kingdom to the ablest prince inevitably led to plots and even assassinations, with the result that the election was apt to be decided not only by the merits but also by the secret maneuvers of the candidate. Even after he had achieved the hallowed status of ruler, the new Inca was seldom wholly secure from the threat of would-be usurpers. Apart from the vicissitudes of Viracocha's reign, rumors of dynastic strife stretched into an even more remote past. Details are sketchy, but legend records that during the reign of Viracocha's father, Yahuar Huaca, conspiracies and rebellions were frequent. Siesa relates that Yahuar was eventually murdered. Even Pachacutec was faced with a serious revolt in Cusco while he was campaigning in Colao, and a disloyal brother tried to dethrone his successor, Tupac Yupanqui, often referred to as Tupac Inca or simply Tupac. The adoption of an heir as co-ruler during a king's lifetime was intended to reduce strife, but matters were complicated by the tendency of rulers to change their minds and substitute a new co-ruler for their original choice. For instance, Pachacutec initially chose Amaru Yupanqui, but later settled on Tupac Yupanqui. Seemingly, Amaru was backed by the religious hierarchy, but accused of inept conduct as a commander, and he was rejected as heir apparent after a conflict between the religious and military elites. Tupac Yupanqui duly succeeded, serving first as co-ruler according to some sources, but was then confronted with an attempted coup by another royal brother who took advantage of the great responsibilities entrusted to him by the king to revolt in the very city of Cusco. Defeated, he was condemned to death. Tupac himself declined to name a co-ruler. He was reportedly not very aged at his death. His demise itself is shrouded in mystery, and several sources, including Cabello, even suggest that he might have been murdered. Tupac's original preference as a successor was withdrawn in favor of Capac Huadi, though the latter was never adopted as a co-ruler. According to Sarmiento, Tupac changed his mind once more, and when he was about to die, named as her Tito Cusi Hualpa, son of his sister wife Mama Oclo. In Cusco, a plot was hatched, partly fomented by female intrigues, to name as ruler Tupac's previous choice, Capac Huadi. But with the backing of Tupac's brother Apoc Achache, the supporters of Tito Cusi prevailed, and he duly ascended the throne, changing his name to Huayna Capac. According to the same chronicler, opinions differ as to whether Capac Huadi was then killed or merely exiled. Cabello de Babo's account states that Tupac's final choice as heir had been Capac Huadi, an illegitimate son, and that the lords of the kingdom, Los Grandes del Reino, made the decision to reject Capac Huadi in favor of Huayna Capac, considered the rightful heir because he was the son of the Goya, or sister wife, of the late ruler. But this was not the end of the story. Apoc Hualpaya, an influential noble who was the second cousin of Tupac, then secretly plotted to set one of his own sons on the throne. For this purpose, he smuggled arms into Cusco, a step that was discovered by Apoc Apache, who suppressed the uprising and killed the rebels. Clearly, therefore, disputes over the succession were not confined to the ultimate and disastrous instance, the civil war between Atahualpa and Huáscar. If the right to succeed was never clearly defined, such disputes were inevitable. The preference expressed by a reigning monarch was important but not always decisive. The only other device for furthering a more orderly succession, sister marriage, was probably first adopted by Tupac, notwithstanding reports attributing to earlier rulers this practice, which failed anyway to solve the problem as Huayna Capac's Coya produced no son. The precise identity or allegiance of opposing factions in such disputes is seldom clear. Accounts concur in reporting that the Orejones were responsible for making the choice, but they do not necessarily state which Orejones were involved or on what grounds the decision was made. As Marius Ziolkowski affirms in stressing the power of the church, the religious factor also was important in the choice of a successor. According to Murua, the nomination depended on the tutelary solar deity, in effect on its priests, but Ziolkowski points out that although, at least in theory, the choice depended upon the high priest, the mouthpiece of the sun, the selection was also influenced by the Señores del Cusco, or the leading persons in the royal panacas or aylus, whose exact number and role in the imperial administration are still a matter of controversy. The same author, therefore, basically questions the notion of a divinely inspired election and concedes that the situation of a recently elected ruler was precarious and unstable. Though matters may have been rather different under the former kings, Pachacutec in effect staged a coup d'état, assuming power by rules that ran counter to former traditions. He transformed the existing ritual religious system in order to forge a new ideological basis for the nascent empire, including special cults, in particular that of Punchao, the young son. He was able to establish a new priestly hierarchy headed by the Mayor Domo del Sol, who was designated by the Inca himself. Hence, this new high priest, in theory the dignitary best able to influence the choice of a monarch, was in practice chosen by that monarch's predecessor. But, as Ziolkowski concludes, such efforts to install a system that ensured a more or less orderly succession achieved poor results, and the same power struggles continued. This, however, does not signify that a ruler, once established, did not acquire an aura of religious sanctity. The imperial cult of the sun served as the ideological basis for the expansion of the state, and a new ruler's elaborate mystical initiation set him above ordinary mortals, endowed as God's elect, with unique powers to destroy his enemies. Problems of succession, and even a proclivity to conspire against the God's elect, are basic to the Inca system of government. In view of the Inca's tendency to re-edit the record, suppressing items unflattering to a new ruler, it is perhaps surprising that the chroniclers learn so much of such dissensions, and that by and large their accounts concur in describing them. The lack of rules to ensure a peaceful succession has served as a destabilizing force in many great empires, of which Rome is an obvious example, but it has seldom destroyed them. The sheer size of the Inca Empire under the later rulers and their prolonged absences from their capital increased the temptation for rival factions to plot against the monarch, however exalted his status. The office, rather than the person, was paramount, and if a rival could dethrone the incumbent, he could claim the absolute submission of those who were now his subjects. One has only to cite the great example of the great Pachacutec, who, according to some accounts, virtually usurped the throne from Urkel. The ruler's riches. The material, as opposed to the spiritual, strength of the Inca ruler derived from his control of land, the basic measure of wealth, and of mines and herds. Cobo sums up the traditional notion that when the Inca conquered a town or province, the land was divided into 3 parts. Of these, he took one for himself, set aside another for the state religion, and left the third for the common use of the people. The proportion assigned to each of the 3 recipients varied from place to place. Cobo, above all, stresses that the division of land showed how absolute was the power of the Inca over everything his vassals possessed. There was no way for them to acquire land except as a gift from the Inca, who would reward individuals for a heroic deed in war or for such services as road or bridge building. Cobo's account is partly based on Polo de Ondegardo, who states that the Inca and the Sun had properties in each province. The Inca may have been the nominal owner of all things, but much property remained in the hands of the traditional local rulers, the Caracas. Mura stresses that the respective land rights of the Inca and of the local potentates are hard to determine because of confusion in these sources between traditional holdings and those later granted by the Inca. Property rights in general will be discussed at greater length in connection with Inca methods of imperial rule. In the present context, we are purely concerned with the Inca ruler's personal holdings and the extent to which his riches were material as well as spiritual. As Roswawowski points out, the extent of the Inca's own possessions, accumulated during his lifetime, and the procedure by which all or part of these were transferred after death to his panaca are hard to unravel in the absence of new data from public and private archives. As she further comments, Inca lands throughout the provinces were more state than private property, though the possibility arises that the sovereign personally owned tracts of land in places remote from the capital. Their produce would not have been sent to far-off Cusco, but used locally. Roswawowski cites an unpublished manuscript that mentioned Tupac Incas' large provincial properties. Quite apart from the possibility of royal possessions in more remote provinces, it is far from evident how the ruler obtained private lands nearer home, as the best near Cusco were mainly held by the royal Aylus. As one alternative, he could confiscate the properties of Aylus unfriendly to him. As a second, he could acquire new land by improved irrigation, a practice mentioned in particular by Cieza and by Garcilasco. By terracing and building new canals, much land could be reclaimed, and cases exist in which rulers did not hesitate to change the course of a river in order to gain additional land. Third, he could send inhabitants of the valley of Cusco as mitimes to other provinces. Many examples exist of mitime groups from Cusco who settled in other provinces as faithful supporters of Inca rule. Their transfer to other areas served the Inca's personal interest, as he could then confiscate their original holdings. Perhaps more relevant than the question of mere ownership is the patent fact that the Inca exercised a certain control over the land in conquered provinces. Regardless of whether he, the Caraca, or the community was the legal owner, he could determine his own and the state's share of the total resources, whether labor to create local infrastructure or produce to be stored locally or sent to Cusco. A similar situation applied to gold and silver mines. In theory, throughout the empire they belonged to the Inca. In practice, however, the local Caracas were clearly also involved in their management. Santillán opines that exploitation could hardly have been very intensified. The Spaniards managed to extract much larger amounts in a much shorter time than the Incas did. Cieza, however, states that great quantities must have been mined in view of the huge stores in Cusco filled with gold. The chroniclers also concur that the Inca owned all the herds of llamas. These animals were vital both as a means of transport and as a source of wool, used for the sumptuous clothing of the Inca and his elite. They were also used for sacrifice. However, Mura, who discusses the problem at length, rejected the notion that the Inca was the sole proprietor, dismissing this as an idea that conformed to the ideology of Cusco but not to basic realities. The Relaciones Geográficas cite instances in Callao in which the church, as well as the state, was given herds and grazing grounds by the Inca. Hence, in a material sense, as the theoretical possessor of all land, mines, and herds, the Inca was the state, just as in a spiritual context, he personified the state religion as offspring of the solar deity. In practice, he may have enjoyed less extensive direct ownership except as pertained to his personal estates, acquired by methods that remain somewhat unclear. Apart from the urge to endow his future panaca, his private needs were perhaps not excessive. Lavish state funds, in which a society tend to be synonymous with those of the ruler, covered his own expenditures, together with the cost of the huge volume of sumptuary goods that by custom he bestowed on others. The social pyramid. The Inca's own person was thus exalted far above that of the highest dignitaries. The rest of society may, like many others of its kind, be compared to a pyramid in form. At its apex stood the inner elite among the Orejones. Betanzos writes that they were all descended from Inca rulers. Their status was unique, enhanced by the fact that the central part of Cusco, the very heart of the sacred city, was their dwelling place. Though the sources often state that only the Orejones lived in central Cusco, these select few clearly also included the priestly elite, charged with the rituals of Coricancha and the many great temples. The Orejones had a special school for their sons, to which Incas by privilege also had access. They alone were entitled to wear sumptuary clothing. Garcilaso even states that they spoke a distinct form of the Quechua language. According to all sources, their position atop the social pyramid was unassailable and immutable. The Orejones were exempt from taxes, a concession the Incas by privilege shared. They were supported by the king through his revenues. In practice, though, they had returned part of what they were entitled to receive, as they were not excused from the duty of regaling the king with precious gifts. Because these were voluntary and the quantities were not fixed, however, they did not rank as tribute. On numerous occasions, uncles, brothers, and sons were named as being among a ruler's leading commanders. In the case of Pachacutec, his various brothers are credited with playing prominent roles. Inca Roca, Apo Maita, and Vica Quirao played an important part in the defeat of the Chancas. Equally, Tupac on various occasions put brothers in command of part of his forces. His two sons are also named as leading captains. In the case of Huayna Capac, to command an expedition to Chinchasuyu. Close relatives, whether brothers or sons, are also frequently mentioned by these sources as being named governor of Cusco in the ruler's absence on a military campaign. In accounts of military campaigns, the Orejones, often close relatives or even brothers of the reigning monarch, are frequently identified as leading generals, and the sources continually stress their key role as commanders in the field and as provincial administrators. However, in early states and empires, distinctions between the exercise of military leadership and civilian administration are often blurred. As provincial governors, Orejones were surely also charged with overseeing the imperial infrastructure involving irrigation, road construction, and town planning, even if the details were delegated to others, specialists in one field or another. Information on the true antecedents of the Orejones is imprecise. The notion that they were all of royal blood, so widely diffused, is perhaps an oversimplification. Despite plural marriage among the ruling class, in the course of a limited number of generations, the rulers alone could scarcely have sired a progeny sufficient enough to form even the nucleus of a force destined to conquer a huge empire. Kirchhoff wonders whether distinguished commoners could have been added to the ranks of the Orejon nobility. The question also arises as to what might have occurred to fledgling nobles conspicuous for a lack of either martial or administrative skills, who thereby fell short of the inflexible norms of their caste. In the absence of any flagrant offense, they could hardly have been executed, as reportedly happened to certain Orejones guilty of conspiracy and of military disobedience. Scant mention occurs of punishment for other failings. But human nature is never wholly conformist, and one can hardly conceive that in any society, ancient or modern, a Spartan upbringing will ensure conformity with relentless standards. If some members of the upper class could resort to base treachery, a tendency that is amply documented, others could surely at times have proved to be lazy, mendacious, or simply overindulgent. In this, as in certain other matters, we are perhaps presented with a rather idealized version of Inca society that ignores, among other things, the treatment meted out by the Inca lords to the occasional black sheep among their progeny. Pachacutec reportedly first enlarged the numbers of those entitled to be called Inca by creating the rank of Inca by privilege. As we have seen, Incas by privilege lived beyond the limits of central Cusco. Whereas the Orejones had their own lands as members of the royal Aylus or received holdings from the ruler, the resources of the Incas by privilege seem to have depended less on land and more on state revenues received from the king. Access to these extensive state revenues formed the basis of their existence. Clear notions of just how the system of government worked at the very highest level are equally hard to form. The available evidence suggests that the key posts were held by the Orejones, though doubtless Incas by privilege also served in the administration of the state. The sources use such phrases as the highest in the land when referring to those deciding certain issues, particularly the succession to the throne. Shadell cites reports of a council of 12, a supra-provincial consultative body composed of one or more Inca representatives from each Cusco moiety and one or two representatives from each of the 4 suyus. Juan Poma also mentions a council of 12, of which 10 members were representatives of the suyus. Damian de la Bandera states that Tupac Yupanqui named a capac, or viceroy, for each of the 4 suyus. These formed the Inca's principal consultative body, together with a secretary who studied the nature of any problem before it was referred to the ruler himself. However, Gibson points out that although Cobo also writes of 4 apos, or heads of the 4 suyus, these can be taken either as members of a council or simply as local governors who were only concerned with problems and decisions within their own territory. Morua writes more specifically of 4 Orejones who formed the king's council and who were quite distinct from the 4 governors of the suyus. The latter, however, had direct access to the council of 4 in Cusco. Moore accepts de la Bandera's assertion that the Inca's council consisted of the 4 lords, the top administrators of the 4 quarters of the empire, and writes of the probability that the Inca depended on their advice in making any major decision. They apparently had the power to resolve all but the most difficult questions without even consulting the Inca and played a leading role in deciding when to wage war. These dignitaries could hardly administer the 4 quarters of the empire by remaining within the bounds of Cusco, but if they were located far from the capital, it is hard to see how they could confer with the ruler on platforms that might suddenly arise, notwithstanding the speed with which verbal messages could be transmitted throughout the empire's length and breadth. Basic both to the comfort and status of the Orejones living in central Cusco was the presence of a menial class known as llanas. Their origins are obscure. Murray questions the tendency of chroniclers to classify them as rebels or people who have been condemned to death and then pardoned. He suggests that llanas already existed in pre-Inca times. They could marry and have children, and their status was probably hereditary. Murray points to a similar servant class in the Lupaca region. These servants might have been recruited from the Lupaca population itself, or they could have derived from a people of lesser standing. The Uru, quite distinct from the Aymara peoples. Among the Lupaca, highly specialized individuals were surely needed to manage the huge herds, amounting to as many as 10,000 head. Murray proposes that these specialists were llanas and that they came to form a separate social group within the community. Whatever the pretext involved, the llanas were basically uprooted people from the provinces brought in to perform services, principally in the capital. Unlike the Midames located in the vicinity of Cusco, the llanas came as individuals. Choi believes they can truly be defined as slaves who might serve temples, the ruler, or even Caracas whom the ruler wished to favor. It was not customary to sell llanas, but rather to donate them as a reward for services. In general terms, they were less oppressed than slaves in other highly developed societies. Notwithstanding their servile condition, the llanas could attain a certain status. They could become artisans, and their numbers include skilled silversmiths brought to Cusco from Chincha and other parts of the coast. The administration, in controlling the Inca realm, extended over vast distances. A well-staffed administrative system was indispensable. Writers often refer to the system as a bureaucracy, though the term derived from the French word for writing desk perhaps acquires a rather special sense when applied to a society in which the blessings of conventional paperwork were unknown. Though the Inca elite presumably made the decisions, detailed planning surely required a corps of experts versed in each aspect of administration and able to ensure that decisions, once made, were put into effect. In a conquest state, the military organization was paramount. In the case of the Incas, the mobilization of armies was complicated by a special factor. Unlike other ancient empires in which much of the army was recruited from the home base or from nearby regions, the Incas increasingly employed levies drawn from the many loyal and reliable peoples located throughout their empire. To quote one instance, forces sent from Callao played a conspicuous role in the campaigns in Ecuador. The frequent deployment over vast distances of such forces and their arrival at the right time and at the right place must have involved military staff work of the highest order. In this and other matters, communications were paramount. Hislop describes the roads as an omnipresent symbol of the power and authority of the state. The system was monumental and constitutes South America's largest contiguous and archaeological remain. The author, however, remarks that this fact should not detract from other feats of prehistoric Andean civilizations whose agricultural terraces and irrigation canals may have required even greater labor inputs than did the Inca road system. Hislop's chapter on Inca bridges amply illustrates the complexity of the technical and administrative problems that affected their construction and maintenance. Bridges of many kinds were built, offering in each case a practical solution based on the particular problem involved for crossing rivers. Such solutions were new and amazing to the first Europeans who saw them. Curiously, Andean bridges never employed the arch, which had been crucial to Western bridge building for the past 2 millennia. Technical considerations also affected the sting of the tampus, or lodgings. Such factors included the supply of water, availability of food, and the avoidance of steep, barren, or marshy terrain. Such feats of engineering obviously required central planning, as well as a highly integrated communication system to settle questions too important to be decided on a purely provincial level, and personnel whose technical qualifications were equal to the task of making plans without the use of writing. The question arises as to whether these plans could be made at all without the use of at least some form of charts or maps, as it seems almost beyond the capacity of the human brain to memorize the whole road system and all the details involved. No such records have survived, however. Quipus could have at least recorded certain statistics, such as the quantities of material needed for a given project. Nonetheless, Craig Morris warns against reliance on models that draw too heavily on principles related to modern states or to tribal societies. Morris accepts that by the time of Pizarro's arrival, some kind of master plan was in place, but one that took fully into account the ecological and cultural diversity of the empire instead of imposing some set pattern of administrative control. The author stresses the complexity of the process of planning the large-scale movement of whole peoples over long distances under the Mitame system, citing as an example the introduction of no less than 14,000 people from different places into the warm lands of Cochabamba to grow maize for the army. In certain cases, not only would peoples be moved thousands of kilometers, but parts of a polity could be detached in situ and assigned to a neighboring polity. As Murrah also observes, the vast Inca territory required a system that could relate the periphery to the center and the coast to the altiplano. This would keep potential rebels under observation of garrisons and permit the Quipucamayos to gather the provincial data needed by the central government. The distinction between decision-making and the strictly technical requirements of administration was reflected in the Inca's social organization. The Orejones lived in the center of Cusco, and in the most ancient civilizations, decision-making tended to be exercised by a nucleus of individuals based on the center of the capital rather than on the periphery. The Incas, by privilege, lived on the outskirts of Cusco and would thus have less easily formed any part of the inner establishment that ruled under the Inca and took control in his absence. Occasionally called administrative Incas, the Incas, by privilege, may have held important posts and made decisions of a more detailed nature, whereas the Orejones, in close accord with the ruler, laid down the overall policy and objectives of the state. The large and important religious hierarchy resided by all accounts in Hurin Cusco, within the orbit of the Orejones who inhabited the central city. The chroniclers seldom referred to the status of the lower echelons of the administrative machine, whose role was perhaps as much technical as supervisory. Shadow suggests that the middle and lower levels of both the central and provincial bureaucracies were staffed mostly by llanas. Though evidence on this point may be incomplete, we know that some llanas did develop skills that raised them far above the level of mere menial workers. Shadow makes a constructive, if tentative, attempt to outline the Inca system of government. He first draws attention to the 11 panakas, defined as the royal court, created by Pachacutec in an attempt, albeit not altogether successful, to secure the legitimacy of the succession. Next in importance came the royal Aylus, who seemed to represent kin groups from which the next potential panaka might be formed. The same author divides the administrative apparatus into clusters. The judicial cluster included the Tokriok, who were responsible for the control of the various provinces and seemed to have been traveling representatives as much as permanent residents in any one province. The judicial officials were the Tokorikok inspectors, specifically assigned to inform them on the administration of justice. The treasury cluster included a hierarchy of officials in charge of quipus related to storehouses. The chief of this group may have been the secretary of the Inca Simin Kipokok, assisted by an accountant general familiar with both the census and revenue totals. The military cluster was the preserve of nobles who served in the field, but who also played a role in the civilian government. Each Inca seems to have had his own procedure for selecting, promoting, and demoting, or executing his generals, most of whom we hear about only in the context of field campaigns or military coups and palace revolts. A further group, the transportation cluster, was most important, as it was responsible for the communications network, roads, bridges, and the system of chasquis, messengers. A key instrument of provincial rule was the decimal system. Inca statistics should not always be interpreted as corresponding exactly to demographic reality, as there cannot always be exactly 100 or 1,000 people in each center of population. It has been suggested that the numerical system might have been borrowed from the Kingdom of Timor. This method of counting, like other statistical data at the disposal of the administrators, would surely have been unmanageable without the quipunats that served to record numbers. Only one known source stems specifically from quipu records, the Declaración de los Quipucamayos, so we possess little direct quipu data, and it becomes easy to overlook their crucial role. Sources, however, concur on their importance. Statistics for the empire as a whole simply could not have been retained in Cusco and officials' heads. Witten cites Murua as stating that much of what survived of Inca history was at least based on data recorded in quipus. However, much of this surviving information is really second-hand. Certain writers who profess to give facts derived from quipus were in fact relaying the reports of prior sources, from which they demonstrably copied part of their data. Witten cites the specific instance of Cabello de Baboa and Murua. The latter claims that much of his knowledge came from quipus, a source to which Cabello even attributes his authentic chronology. Both chroniclers tend to convey the impression of diligence, involving much time spent on interviews with quipucamayos, the ostensible key to Inca historical information. Suspiciously, though, their accounts of how they gleaned information from quipucamayos are couched in almost identical terms. Ciesa writes that accountants, described as quipucamayos, resided in each province, recording the tribute that was due. He tells of the curaca of the province of Chaucha, who sent for his quipucamayos in order to show off their talents to Ciesa. They were able to state from their meticulous records the exact quantities of everything that had been given to the Spaniards since the arrival of Pizarro, whether gold, silver, textiles, maize, or animals. Ciesa was amazed at the precision of their methods. In Ciesa's time, quipucamayos were still functioning in each valley and produced reports every 4 months. Similar skills were used to keep track of garrisons, stores, troop movements, and many other aspects of administration, both civil and military. As many sources affirm, the schooling of the quipucamayo was prolonged and laborious. Trainees had to learn to handle the many different colors, strings, and knots, and to familiarize themselves with past records. These specialist skills and feats of memory, as seen by the first European observers, were likely based on long practical experience and a total dedication to their calling. Asher's account gives details, complete with diagrams of how the quipus function, depending on the length of the cords as well as on the colors and the number of knots. As he explains, our ignorance of the exact methods derives from the fact that known surviving quipus, having been taken from cemeteries, were buried with dead persons for whom they had a significance in life, but they were without meaning in the absence of a contextual relationship. Finance and property. Though information on general administration remains elusive, on specific aspects of the problem data are more copious, in particular on the mita, the term for services exacted by the state from each individual or community. On this matter, as on others, accounts differ widely. Murra describes the mita as a collective obligation on the part of married males to work for the Inca or the state for a given number of days per annum on such assignments as roads, bridges, agriculture, as well as public works in the capital. Murra is dealing mainly with the core region of empire. However, as we shall later see in the case of imperial administration, local Caracas in more distant provinces also had claims on the labor of their people, but apparently exacted no tribute in kind. The mita system was equally used for recruiting purposes, though the proportion of the population drafted for war in this way is hard to quantify. Subsistence needs had to be taken into account, and the ratio of those conscripted must also have varied with the importance of the campaign and the proximity of the community to the battlefield. Not every ethnic group provided its quota. Some coastal populations were not considered trustworthy, and their ability to endure combat at an elevation of, say, 3,500 meters may also have been a factor. Many sources confirm that tribute was normally paid not in goods or produce, but in the form of labor used to provide such items as textiles or wood to the state. Santillán, in his fairly explicit account, includes among items produced by mita labor articles made of feathers and precious metals. The latter were all sent to Cusco. Ciesa, however, does not hesitate to use the word tribute, mentioning, among other products, huge quantities of maize. Peoples of the regions nearest to the capital, however, were used more for construction works in Cusco. Where goods were sent, they were carefully checked by Ordejon officials. For the Cusco region itself, the mita was essentially a method of centralizing labor available in the agricultural dead season as part of the overall planning of public works. This massive corvée work force is alleged to have numbered tens of thousands. Such levies were used, for instance, in the channeling of the Urubamba River. As Moore points out, matters tend to be confused by the chroniclers, who were somewhat misled because they themselves saw the laborers rather than their produce, which in effect was a form of tribute. However, if what the Incas levied was in effect tribute in one form or another, considerable evidence shows that they also did much to increase the overall output of those whom they taxed. The description of the Inca tribute as being levied solely in terms of service had a natural appeal for certain writers who were adherents of the labor theory of value and who liked to use the word socialism in the Inca context. The system for mining precious metals for the state was somewhat different, relying more on craftsmen organized by the Caracas than on mita labor. Miners were local specialists exempt from ordinary forced labor. When the gold reached its final destination in Cusco, much was lavished by the Inca on his entourage as a reward for distinguished service. Moreover, the Caracas, when they visited the capital, were expected to offer golden gifts to the Inca, who in return loaded them with other presents. Mitimes and llanas. The notion of a city inhabited exclusively by a noble or upper class, together with a quota of llanas tacked as servants, is very hard to conceive in practice. Cusco, taken as a whole, was fairly extensive. The question therefore arises as to what other elements also comprise its population. Rose cites eyewitnesses as stating that there were no poor people living in Cusco. He agrees that such statements should not be taken as excluding the llanas. But these eyewitnesses were surely concerned with the two moieties of central Cusco, Hurin and Hanan. Their observations hardly account for what lay beyond the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, not only the residences of the Incas by privilege, but also the outer reaches of the greater Cusco. This area was inhabited not by patricians, but more by plebeians, members of a wide range of social groups. Early reports described the large output of the gold and silversmiths in Cusco itself, as well as much featherwork and massive quantities of pottery. In addition, building construction in Cusco and many other forms of public works implied the presence of a skilled labor force. Part of this labor could have been supplied from the subjects of nearby Caracas who lived outside the limits of the capital itself. But much of the workforce seemingly consisted of mitimes, people from other regions transported en masse to the valley of Cusco. Ciesa, writing obviously, as mentioned above, of outer Cusco, states that most of the city was full of foreigners, i.e. mitimes from far away, who had been employed there since the reign of Pachacutec. In Ciesa's time, people from Ecuador, originally brought in groups as mitimes, were still present in Cusco. These migrants were all part of the labor force then available, todos de industria. Ciesa also mentions that the Incas' personal herds were attended by mitimes. As a form of social engineering, the mitime system was used on such a scale that it is hard to find a parallel elsewhere in the world. It played a vital role in the process of conquest as a means of pacifying newly acquired lands by removing the more unreliable elements and replacing them with loyal settlers. But the same system also had a major impact on the capital. Espinosa cites documents that show that a large part of the mitimes settled in Lupaca territory, in some cases up to 80%, actually came from the vicinity of Cusco. The documents refer to them as mitimas Inca and state that whole ayllus were transported. In turn, Lupaca groups have been sent over the course of time to more than 20 places, including Cusco. Garcia Diaz states that Lupacas in the Cusco region served as builders and masons. The transference of such numbers away from the Cusco region, moved like pieces on a chessboard, served a dual purpose. First, their lands were vacated and could be either assigned to specialist groups brought from elsewhere or confiscated by the ruler. Such settlers would have included agriculturists skilled in the growing of maize in high altitudes. Apart from its use for military supplies, maize had a major ritual significance in Inca culture. The second objective was to settle wholly dependable groups of people from the vicinity of Cusco itself in other key regions. Such mitimes from the heartland were compensated with special privileges in their new home. Mura suggests that mitimes sent from Cusco occasionally included Incas by privilege, and even a few individuals of loyal descent. However, the only chronicler quoted in this report is Murua, and the information he provides is confined to the sanctuaries of the Lake Titicaca region. Though Cusco could not have functioned without ample skilled labor, the extent to which it relied on mitimes for manpower might tend to be exaggerated. The majority of workers could equally have been llanas, and the proportion of each is hard to establish. Any attempt to define the respective roles of mitimes and llanas in the economy of Cusco is further obfuscated by the rather fine distinction generally drawn between the status and origin of each. Both are described as descended from rebels, the difference being that the latter came as individuals, whereas the former were moved in groups. The chroniclers themselves stress the danger of confusing the two categories, and Ciesa refers to the error of Lopez de Homara in failing to make a correct distinction. Rostrovsky mentions, on the one hand, silversmiths and potters brought to Cusco in whole groups, i.e. mitimes, and on the other, numerous artisans from the coast still living in a single ayllu in Cusco, whom she describes as llanas. Both potters and silversmiths were transported from the coastal region not only to Cusco, but also to many localities in the Altiplano, such as Cajamarca, where potters from Colique were settled, and Huamachuco. Some of these skilled artisans from the coast formed an important part of the labor force used to produce Spanish colonial silverware. Basic premises. As Craig Morris observes, we tend to ignore the mechanisms of Inca administration and the degree of state planning involved, though any complex scheme of imperial organization would have been hard to establish in detail in the brief century of Inca hegemony. The author stresses the importance of religion and ceremony in holding together the varied and spatially discontinuous parts of the realm. Studies in Huánuco, for instance, have revealed that feasts and ceremonies were the focal point of the activities of that important Inca center. Many, if not most, of the goods sent from the hinterland and held in storehouses were manifestly destined for the city's ceremonial life and for services connected with this purpose. Hence, Huánuco was a consumer center in terms of economic activities, and primary production was located elsewhere. In writing of the likely characteristics of Inca administration, one is virtually forced to resort to speculation and to assume that a complex state administrative service was indispensable. Any comparison with better documented empires may surely serve to reinforce this assumption. But speculation leads inevitably to the use of the word must, a word suggestive of purely subjective opinions and therefore treated with caution on a professional level. But in the case of Cusco, the expression is hard to avoid. One can only assert that there must have been an established and fairly elaborate machinery for making decisions and plans, even if we know so little about it. A machinery, moreover, that could function in the ruler's absence. Huayna Capac spent much of his reign away from Cusco, and it is hard to see how he could control the whole empire from his second capital, Tumebamba, situated in its northern extremity. Chroniclers concur in describing Tupac's prolonged forays to remote regions long before this. Hence, notwithstanding the resources devoted to means of rapid communication, there must have been others able to make major decisions in the ruler's absence, quite apart from the vexed problem of succession when a ruler died. Pressing problems, some of an overall nature and others strictly military, would have arisen. For instance, what action to take against rebellious tribes in recently conquered Chile, what forces to deploy for the purpose, what steps to take if any part of the road network, say, in the Cochabamba region, needed major repair or renewal, and in general terms, what proportion of available resources to devote to each sector of the state-controlled economy, questions demanding constant and at times instant revision in the light of changing circumstances and new challenges. The Inca realm could hardly have functioned without a stream of orders and instructions to provincial authorities and a corresponding flowback of data to the capital, much of which might have been recorded on quipus. The governors could hardly rule as self-sufficient potentates. Moreover, they might need to be replaced instantly, because of death or for other reasons. Such matters also required prompt decisions in Cusco. Precisely who belonged to any decision-making body remains unclear. Possibilities include a group of close relatives of the Inca, a council of 4, a council of 12, or even a single individual acting as a trusted deputy of the monarch and left in charge as governor of Cusco. However prestigious the Inca as the sacred offspring of Inti, he could not perform the miracle of being in every place at once and was more often to be found in some distant part of his far-flung realm than in Cusco. Hence, in the final analysis, though it may be true to regard the Inca system of government as strictly elitist, it is probably less accurate to describe it as controlled solely by a deified despot. This concludes Chapter 5.